Today we're going to be talking about the Uvalde shooting. It was in Uvalde, Texas at the Robb Elementary School. This is a video that from the moment this incident occurred, I knew I was going to have to speak on. It's also been something I've been putting off for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons I've been putting this off is because if I'm going to intelligently speak on a subject, I want to make sure I have all the information available. And it's taken a long time for that information to come out, which I understand and I don't actually have a problem with. There's been a lot of information that's come out. There's still some more things that I would like to see. And maybe it's out there and I just haven't seen it yet. Like specifically, I would like to see what the doors of the classroom look like. I would like to see a specific diagram of where the shooter was in the room. But that information has not yet come out to my knowledge. So I have to work with what I have. So I've watched everything and I have an idea of what happened and I have an idea of what went wrong and where it went wrong. And my opinion of what happened in this shooting is different than what a lot of other people think. That leads to the other reason I've been kind of putting off making this video is because this subject has become such a lightning rod. Everybody is responding to this with such emotion, which is understandable as well. We're talking about children who were murdered. This is a horrible, horrible thing. Emotions are riding high. Everybody wishes that they were there, that they could have stopped this from happening, that they could have prevented this. And there's a lot of people who have an opinion and they would like to tell you how they would have done it. And I understand where everybody is coming from on that. I don't think that the accusations being made against these officers are the appropriate ones. By all means, there was a lot of mistakes made. And the biggest mistake, I'm going to say, was actually attention to detail. I'll do my best to walk through what happened, and I'll try to throw in some pictures and some video clips here in a moment. But a lot of people are calling the officers who responded to this cowards, and I don't think that's fair and appropriate. I think what happened was a lapse in attention to detail under a very high stress, high pressure situation with literally bullets flying at them. And that failure just rippled on out. And it was repeated over and over and over again by multiple people. And at the end of the day, there were hundreds of officers on scene. And they failed to correct that initial error. And that's what led to the result that we're looking at today. Before I get into the actual events, we have to talk about where we came from. The reason that we know what we know today and how officers are trained. And kind of the evolution of that training over the years. One of the most famous school shootings, I guess you could say, or one of the ones that had a dramatic impact on how police officers trained and what changed the way police officers were trained, was the Columbine shooting. In that shooting, it was later determined that the officers who responded and the way they were trained to respond actually caused more death and destruction than what should have been done. Because for Columbine, the officers were taught, and this is what all officers across the country were taught at the time, was that you create a perimeter around the school, you don't let the shooters out, you contain them inside the school, and then you get tactical officers, hopefully a SWAT team in there as quick as possible. Unfortunately, it can take an hour or more to get enough tactical assets on scene to go in and neutralize a threat like what was in Columbine. And they created a situation where these kids could literally go from room to room to room executing their classmates. And that caused a lot more death and destruction than what was necessary. After Columbine, we were taught, I think it was the quad method. And this was a method where preferably in groups of 4, you would enter a building. You would, as soon as you got to the building, you would wait for at least a couple more officers, and as soon as you had a few officers, You would go into the building and you would start clearing rooms. In a long hallway like what we saw in the Uvalde video, you would preferably have 2 teams of 4. You go down the hall, and as soon as you find a classroom, there's a technique. You enter the room, you leave one guy out in the hall to keep security for everybody. The people go into the rooms, they clear the room, they come back out, they meet, they go back down the hall, go in the rooms, and it's like a dance. You're waltzing down the hall, you're marking out, where injured people are, you're calling them out, and you're continuing to clear rooms and buildings as you work your way to the shooter. That was a way that I was trained at some point in my career. I can't remember if it was military or police, but that was one of the things I was trained to do. That training has now changed to the way we do it now. Now our active shooter response is that if there's an active shooter reported at a building, could be a school, could be a hospital, could be an office building, it doesn't matter. Your job as the first officer on scene is to directly engage that threat. There's a little bit of nuance and some wiggle room. If you pull into the building, the parking lot, whatever, and there's another officer 4 seconds behind, there's nothing wrong with waiting for that officer. But if you pull up, you're the only one there, you can hear sirens, but you can't see any other officers. It's your job to enter that building, and you go directly towards the sound of gunfire. Your job is to interrupt that gunman as quickly as possible. Hopefully, you can catch him off guard and kill him and stop the killing. One of the thoughts behind this process is that by you directly entering the building, interrupting him as he's shooting, you'll have the element of surprise. One of the other things that it does for you as an officer who's responding is that it doesn't allow you time to think. You're not thinking, you're acting. You're not just reacting. You've got your gun out. You're actively on the hunt for this person. You're not thinking about what you're doing. You're going directly towards the sound of gunfire. You find him, you kill him. That's how we're trained to do things now. With that in mind, there are some myths about what happened in Uvalde, and I would like to talk about them now. And then I want to get into how this situation evolved. The first thing that I would like to address is that there was cell phone video that came out the day after that showed officers outside of the school setting up a perimeter, and they were fighting with parents. And I think there was even a mother who was placed under arrest. At least she was handcuffed and detained and drug away. The people in these videos were trying to say that the officers were refusing to go into the building, that they were not engaging the gunman, that they sat outside the building and waited for a SWAT team to arrive, rather than to go in and save children, that they were just surrounding this building while children were inside getting killed. That was not true. When officers arrived at the school, they immediately entered the school. They went down the hall and they did engage the gunman. There were officers inside the school that were at least trying to do something with the gunman. We'll get to that in here in a moment. There were officers outside of the school that had multiple jobs. They were trying to make sure that this gunman did not escape their perimeter. They were also going around the school on the outside, opening windows and helping children and teachers escape safely.
Go. Kids coming out. 320, are you going to be knocking on the door? 115? Cover those windows, guys. Okay, room's clear. Next one.
So you have the interior perimeter, which is the people watching the actual door where the gunman is hiding. You have the exterior perimeter, which is people making sure that the gunman doesn't get outside of the school, and they're trying to safely evacuate teachers and students. Then you have that third layer of the perimeter. That's the one that's actually facing out, and they're making sure that people who don't belong in that scene don't make it into that scene. You can't have an active shooter response or even a barricaded subject response when you have a bunch of civilians running around getting in the way. It's not safe for anybody. The next thing I want to talk about is one of the myths that came about when all this began was that there was a solitary Border Patrol tactical officer who arrived on scene. He saw a bunch of these fat, stupid, lazy cops having a perimeter on the outside of the school doing nothing but arresting children while their kids were inside being murdered, and that this guy went into the school all by himself, found the gunman, and killed him, saving the day. That is absolutely not true. There's a picture of him right here in the school, and you can see that there's guys in tactical gear up ahead of him, and he actually arrived, 40 minutes after everything began. He did end up working his way up towards the stack. I'm not sure if he was one of the people that made entry, but he certainly did not come in all by himself, go in and kill this gunman. The next one, this is the officer who was looking at his phone. People took a screenshot of what was on the video and they cropped it so you can't see what's going on around him. And they had some things to say about him. I think they called him fucking pathetic. The officer in this picture is Officer Ruiz. His wife works at this school. He responded to the shooting. He responded to a shooting at his wife's school. And while he was on scene, he looked at his phone, hoping to see a message from his wife letting him know that she was okay. Turns out she was not okay, that she died that day. There were different parts in the video where you can see him talking about how his wife has been shot and he needs to get to her, that he was terrified for her. Those are the reasons that he had his phone out. Some of the other reasons that officers had their phones out when they were inside the building is because their radios didn't work. This is a very common problem with the types of radios that police officers use. They're not cell phone devices, they're radios. Often you can hear somebody talking to you on your radio, but when you key, you're unable to transmit through the building. It's just a limitation of the equipment that we use. So often when we're in situations like this, we have to use our cell phones rather than our walkies. The next picture that I want to show you is this guy using hand sanitizer. This guy drew a lot of criticism because everyone's saying there's literally kids inside getting shot and killed, and here he is using hand sanitizer. There's a couple things I would like to correct about that, is that there were not kids actively being shot while he was using hand sanitizer. I also want to point out that if you look down the hallway in this picture, there's already a tactical team stacked up on the door and they're getting ready to make entry. The word had been spread that they're getting ready to make entry on the room and that they were going to start bringing out wounded children. This guy was teamed up with a paramedic. He was preparing himself to give first aid to kids. He'd been waiting out there for a long time with nothing to do. He was frustrated and he was trying to prepare himself for what was going on. In his mind, he was running through all the steps of what you have to do if you're going to be a medic. And one of the things that probably popped into his head was, I need to clean my hands. So he went and put some hand sanitizer on his hands because he was expecting in a very short period of time to be doing life-saving first aid on children. One of the biggest problems with the situation that happened in Uvalde is that people are taking little snippets without context and being dishonest about what's happening. And that's why this guy who was a medic with medical gear behind him is having people make fun of him because they don't know what it is that was going through his head and what he was actually doing at the time. One of the other things that I've heard a lot of people suggest is, why didn't they just break a window and go in after him that way, or shoot him through a window, something like that. There's a couple of problems with that. One, we don't know what they were seeing when they were, if they were even looking through a window, if they had the ability to do so. That's something to keep in mind. If this guy was using children as a barricade, that's something that could have been happening. I don't know. I wasn't there. Here's a little video of an officer trying to break a window and doing so unsuccessfully.
I gotta get him out, bro.
Rob's cool. Rob's cool. Somebody at the office.
Watch out. Ah, fuck.
So after seeing that, you have to decide, how are they going to break that window? And are they working under the assumption that all the children in that classroom have already been shot and killed? Or are they working under the assumption that the children in that classroom, there's some of them that are completely uninjured and that are being used as hostages? How are you going to break that window without hurting the children inside is something to seriously consider. I don't know, there's just a lot of things to consider in these situations that people act like it's a very simple thing. So now getting into the actual response, I don't know how much video I'm going to show, but I can tell you that this all started when this guy, I'm assuming he was just driving too fast and he planned on pulling into the building, jumping out like some kind of, in his mind, some kind of badass, running into school and starting some shooting. And he wrecked his vehicle. About a minute or two after wrecking his vehicle, some people came out to check on him, and he shot at those people, causing them to run back to the building. It took him about 2 more minutes from where he was there to make it into the building. Once he entered the building through a door that was unlocked for unknown reasons. The school had 2 minutes. I don't know if that's enough time to lock down a building or not. I've also been told that there was no PA system in that building. These are the beginnings of the failures. He walked into the building, walked down a hall, turned directly into one of the first classrooms he saw, and began firing. Officers arrived on scene within 2 minutes of him opening fire and proceeded down the hall, directly engaging the suspect. Unfortunately, they were overwhelmed by fire, and he had a position of tactical advantage on them. Here's a picture of the doors that the officers were trying to get into. It's recessed. I believe those are like steel or some kind of metal doors with a small window in each door. The officers had a difficult time seeing into them to see what was going on, but he could hear very clearly what was going on outside the door, and when an officer's approached that door, it's very easy for him just to shoot through the door. The officers were also under the impression that those doors were locked because when a school goes into lockdown, the doors are supposed to be locked. There's video a little bit later in the incident that shows officers helping students come out of a door that was locked. And they start calling for a key so they can get down to this locked door. So here you have a situation where you have a gunman who is holed up in a room, barricading himself. It's no longer an active shooter situation. You have kids in that room that are in desperate need of medical attention. You have to figure out how you're going to get down to them without creating a pile of dead officers in front of the door that would prevent you from getting into that room and saving those children. That is the situation that these guys found themselves in. There was one piece of information that I still haven't listed. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to walk you through my thought process when I started watching this for the first time. I did everything I could to block out what everybody else was saying because I knew that they didn't have all the information. And with me watching this stuff without all the information as well, I wanted to try to think about what those officers were going through, what they were seeing, and how they were dealing with that situation. I was trying to figure out where they went wrong. And one of the things that I did was I took a screenshot of the doors and I sent them to my buddy who was a SWAT officer for 20 plus years in a very large city. It wasn't the city that I work in. And I said, how would you breach these doors without explosives as a SWAT officer? Like, how can a patrol officer show up on this scene and breach these doors under fire? Because what these officers did is they went down to the door. They assumed it was locked because it's supposed to be locked, because that is the procedure for an active shooter. The video you're watching right now is one of the BORTAC guys. He has a large ring of keys. He's trying to find the master key to the school, or at a minimum, a key that's going to possibly open the door that they need to get into to engage this gunman. As you can see, even the most experienced tactical officers on scene were working under the assumption that this door was locked, and if the door was locked, it was not possible to engage the gunman. I think this is important because this goes contrary to what a lot of people are saying about what happened that day. That was the assumption that they made, and that was the fatal mistake that made this go as long as it did. The officers who responded down there were overwhelmed and they were unable to get to that door. I know for a fact that they didn't try to open the door, because if they did, they would have found it unlocked. For one reason or another, they were unable to get to that door. They didn't have proper armor. They were overwhelmed by gunfire. I understand that. They had to pull back. They changed this from an active shooter situation to a barricaded subject situation. When I was talking to my buddy about this, He said that verbatim. He's like, the way we train on active shooter response is that you go in, you go directly towards the sound of gunfire, and if he ends up holding himself in a room and barricading himself, then you slow everything down and you deal with it like it's a barricaded subject. That was the situation that these officers found themselves in. That's the reason that everything slowed down and the response took so long. The biggest error that occurred is that when tactical officers started showing up, when they started showing up with shields and stuff, that kind of equipment, nobody went down and checked that door. They waited outside that room for what felt like an eternity because they were trying to find the proper way to breach that door. It hasn't come out yet, but I think they breached it with explosives. Because normal patrol officers don't have explosives. Only certain people can breach doors with explosives on the police department. So even once all the tactical officers had arrived, they still waited in that hallway because they needed to have a proper plan and proper method to breach that door, because they didn't realize it was unlocked, because nobody went and checked that door. This is something that is fundamental to police work that we're all taught, and that this time, with everything that was going on, it slipped literally everybody's mind. And that is probably the most tragic part about this whole situation. I was thinking about this the other day when I realized what the problem was, and I was thinking about how do I talk about this subject? And attention to detail is probably one of the most important aspects of being a police officer. You have to be always attentive to your surroundings. I've had ride-alongs where we've driven down the road and I flip back around and they're like, "Oh, what are you doing?" I'm like, "Oh, we're going to go talk to that guy that was doing that thing over by that car." And he's like, "I didn't even see that guy." I'm like, "I know. It's because you don't have the same attention to detail that I have." There's also the idea that we overlap our responsibilities with each other. If I respond to a call, let's say there's a shooting down the road, and I get a description of a male white with a clown tattoo on top of his head, wearing a white tank top, green pants, and yellow shoes, and I drive down the road and I find that guy, I jump out, I take him into custody, I search him, and then the officers who responded to scene come out to place him under arrest and take him up to headquarters and do their thing. When we exchange custody of that suspect, they take him out of the car, they search him again, then they take my cuffs off, put their cuffs on, and then they secure him in their cruiser. When I place a guy in custody and I search him, and then they come back and they search him as well, that is not something that insults me. That's something that we're trained to do. That's something that we're taught to do. You never assume that the person before you did everything perfectly. That was the fatal flaw in how they responded to Uvalde. The first officers assumed that the door was locked and they never checked it. And then everybody that responded afterwards was working under the same assumption, because the doors are supposed to be locked. That's the way it's supposed to happen. If somebody had checked that door, they might have gotten in a lot sooner. They might have been able to neutralize that threat and give medical aid to those children. I don't believe that those men were cowards. I believe the initial men who arrived on scene did what they were supposed to do. They engaged the gunman. They got him to stop the shooting and the killing. They were no longer in a frame of mind where they could engage the suspect, because they had already broken their train. You arrive on scene, you move directly to the sound of gunfire without thinking, you address that suspect, you kill him if you can. once he became a barricaded suspect, everybody kind of forgot what they were doing. I've been on scene of many SWAT barricades. I've been the guy holding the door for, it seems like an eternity, making sure that that suspect doesn't come out through that door. And I've had SWAT officers come up, put a shield in front of me, tap me on the shoulder and say, I've got this. They ask me for all the information I have, and then they will verify that information with themselves. That's the way these things are supposed to be handled. That did not happen in Uvalde. Unfortunately, this is going to be something that we're going to be using as a tool to learn and train officers to be better for the next time. I think that's all I got to say about that.